We've all felt the sting of being laughed at when we're just trying to belong. We've all wished someone strong would stand up for us when the world feels cruel. In the Viking feast hall, where warriors celebrate their victories, Ragna the fisherwoman sits alone as mockery fills the air around her. The benches are too narrow, the whispers too sharp, and the shame too heavy to bear. Then something incredible happens. Ulfar Long-Mane, the most feared warrior in the clan, rises from his throne. The hall falls silent. What he does next shocks everyone. He walks to Ragna, offers her his own carved seat, and stands beside her like a guardian. In that moment, strength isn't about muscles or swords. It's about choosing kindness when no one expects it. But what happened in Ulfar's past that taught him this lesson? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The settlement of Hrafnbjorn lay nestled between the dark waters of the fjord and the rolling hills that turned golden with autumn's touch. Smoke rose from dozens of hearths, carrying the scent of roasting meat and fresh bread into the crisp morning air. This was harvest time, when the clan gathered to celebrate another year's survival in these northern lands, where winter came early and stayed long. In the modest dwelling near the docks, Ragna Eriksdottir stirred the embers in her hearth, watching sparks dance upward like tiny spirits seeking the sky. The wooden walls around her seemed to press closer each morning, filled with memories of laughter that no longer echoed within them. Her husband Magnus had built this home with his own hands 23 years ago, when they were young and full of dreams about the family they would raise together. Those dreams lay buried now in the rocky ground behind the settlement, marked by a simple stone carved with Magnus's name and the raven symbol of their clan. 3 winters had passed since the fever took him, and Ragna still reached across the bed each morning, expecting to find his warmth beside her. She rose from her chair, a sturdy piece that Magnus had crafted for her broader frame, knowing she would need furniture built to last. The woman who stared back from the polished bronze mirror bore little resemblance to the bride who had danced at her wedding feast. Where once her body had been strong and lean from years of hauling nets, now she carried the weight of grief and too many lonely meals eaten in silence. Her face, once quick to smile, had settled into lines of quiet endurance, yet her hands remained steady and capable. They had pulled countless fish from the fjord's cold depths, mended nets in the pre-dawn darkness, and guided her small boat through storms that would have challenged many warriors. The clan might whisper about her appearance, but none could question her skill or her dedication to the work that fed them all. Ragna pulled on her thick woolen cloak and stepped into the morning light. The harbour stretched before her, dotted with fishing boats preparing for the day's work. Some of the younger fishermen nodded respectfully as she passed, remembering how she had taught them to read the water's moods and the sky's warnings. Others looked away, uncomfortable with the changes 3 years of sorrow had wrought upon her. At the far end of the settlement, where the great hall dominated the landscape like a sleeping giant, preparations for the harvest feast had already begun. Servants hurried back and forth, carrying armloads of rushes for the floor and bundles of pine boughs to freshen the air. The massive doors stood open, revealing the long tables and benches that would soon groan under the weight of the year's finest foods. High above the hall's entrance, carved ravens spread their wings in eternal flight, their eyes seeming to watch over all who entered. These were the symbols of Hrafnbjorn, the raven bear, whose spirit was said to guide the clan through both battle and peace. The hall itself had been built by Ulfar's grandfather, designed to hold the entire clan when duty or celebration called them together. Ulfar Long-Mane stood in the doorway of the hall, his tall frame silhouetted against the warm light spilling from within. At 45 years of age, he remained an imposing figure, though the years had softened some of his harder edges. His hair, once the color of burnished copper, now showed streaks of silver that caught the morning sun. The scar that ran from his left temple to his jaw, a memento from a raid in his younger days, had faded to a thin, white line that somehow made his weathered face more distinguished than fearsome. On the wall behind him, barely visible in the shadows, hung his battle-worn axe. The weapon had been his constant companion for nearly 3 decades, its iron head nicked and scarred from countless encounters. Yet it had remained untouched on its wooden pegs for the past 5 years, gathering dust like a relic from a more violent age. Ulfar's transformation from feared raider to thoughtful leader had surprised many, but none questioned his authority or his genuine care for his people. He watched the settlement come alive with quiet satisfaction. Children ran between the houses, their laughter mixing with the calls of merchants setting up their stalls for the evening's trading. Elderly clan members sat in the warm patches of sunlight, sharing stories and advice with anyone willing to listen. This was what he had fought to protect, not just the land or the wealth, but the simple rhythm of life that bound his people together. His eyes found Ragna as she made her way toward the docks, and he felt the familiar tightness in his chest that came whenever he saw her walking alone. He had known her since childhood, remembered her wedding day when she had glowed with joy and promise. Magnus had been his friend, a good man who deserved better than to die young and leave his wife to face the world's cruelties alone. The changes in Ragna over the past 3 years troubled Ulfar more than he cared to admit. Not because of her appearance. He had seen enough of life to know that grief wore different faces and took different tolls, but because of the way others treated her. The whispers, the sideways glances, the casual cruelties that people inflicted when they thought no one important was watching. He had been tempted to speak out before, to use his authority to silence the gossips and scolds. But he understood that such intervention might only make things worse for Ragna, marking her as someone who needed the chieftain's protection rather than earning respect on her own merits. Still, watching her bear these small indignities day after day had awakened something protective in him, a feeling he had thought buried with his own family. Astrid Olafsdottir, Ragna's closest remaining friend, emerged from the weaving house with an armload of new cloth for the feast decorations. She was a small, fierce woman whose quick wit and sharper tongue had kept her unmarried well past the usual age. Most men found her too formidable, which suited Astrid perfectly. She valued her independence and had little patience for fools of any gender. "The hall looks ready for a king's visit," she called to Ulfar as she passed. "Though I hope your guests tonight have better manners than some kings I've heard about." Ulfar smiled at her pointed comment. Astrid never shied away from speaking her mind, and he suspected she was referring to more than just table etiquette. "I'm counting on you to keep everyone in line, Astrid. Your tongue is sharper than most warriors' swords, and twice as effective," she replied with a grin, before continuing toward the hall. The morning progressed with the familiar bustle of preparation. Hunters returned with fresh game, their success ensuring that tonight's feast would be remembered for its abundance. The settlement's best cooks had been working since before dawn, preparing dishes that would showcase the clan's prosperity and the land's bounty. In the great hall, servants arranged the seating with careful attention to rank and relationship. The high table, where Ulfar would sit with the clan's most honored members, commanded a view of the entire hall. Below it, long tables stretched in orderly rows, each place marked by tradition and status. The benches themselves told a story of the clan's values. Built narrow and sturdy, they reflected a time when Vikings prized lean efficiency over comfort. Warriors needed to move quickly, to rise from their seats at a moment's notice if danger threatened. The furniture spoke of a harder age, when survival often depended on speed and agility. But times had changed, and so had the people they were meant to serve. What had once been practical now felt exclusionary, a subtle reminder that some bodies fit better into this world than others. Yet tradition held strong, and the benches remained unchanged, year after year. As the sun reached its peak, Ragna completed her morning's work and began the walk back to her dwelling. Her boat rode low in the water, heavy with the day's catch, a good sign for the feast ahead. She had always taken pride in her contribution to the clan's welfare, even if that contribution often went unnoticed or unacknowledged. The path from the docks led past the great hall, and she could hear the sounds of preparation growing louder as the afternoon progressed. Part of her looked forward to the feast, to the rare opportunity to sit among her clanmates and share in their celebration. But another part, a part that grew stronger with each passing season, dreaded the whispered comments and meaningful looks that would follow her throughout the evening. Still, she would go. Magnus had always loved the harvest feast, and she honored his memory by maintaining the traditions they had once shared. She would dress in her finest clothes, arrange her graying hair as best she could, and take her place among the clan. She would endure whatever came, as she had learned to endure so many things since becoming a widow. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the settlement as evening approached. Soon the hall would fill with voices and laughter, the warmth of community binding the clan together for one more precious night before winter's approach. For most, it would be a time of joy and fellowship. For Ragna, it would be another test of her quiet courage, another opportunity to prove that she belonged here, despite the changes that grief had wrought upon her. She did not know that this feast would be different from all the others, that a single act of unexpected kindness would transform not just her own life, but the very nature of what it meant to belong to the clan of Hrafnbjorn. The carved ravens above the hall's entrance seemed to watch with ancient wisdom as the sun began its descent toward the western hills. Tonight their people would gather once more, and the bonds that held them together would be tested in ways none could foresee. The great hall of Hrafnbjorn blazed with torchlight as the clan gathered for the harvest feast. Flames danced along the walls, casting flickering shadows that seemed to bring the carved ravens to life. The air thrummed with conversation and laughter, the sound of a community celebrating another year's survival and prosperity. Long tables groaned under the weight of the feast. Roasted boar glazed with honey, fresh bread still warm from the ovens, wheels of aged cheese, and barrels of the finest mead the settlement could produce. The hall had been transformed into a place of warmth and abundance, every surface decorated with the golden sheaves and autumn branches that marked the season's turning. At the head of the hall, Ulfar's high seat commanded attention like a throne, carved from a single massive oak and adorned with bear heads whose eyes seemed to glare down at the assembled clan. It spoke of power earned through strength and wisdom. Thick wolfskin cushions softened its imposing lines, but even covered, the chair radiated authority. This was more than furniture. It was a symbol of leadership, of the responsibility to guide and protect that rested on the chieftain's shoulders. Ulfar himself sat easily in the great chair, his presence both commanding and welcoming. He wore his finest clothes for the occasion, a deep blue tunic embroidered with silver thread, a cloak of rich brown wool fastened with a bronze brooch shaped like a raven in flight. His long hair had been carefully braided with silver bands that caught the torchlight, and the old scar on his face seemed less prominent in the warm glow of the feast. The evening had begun with the traditional ceremonies. Elder Thorvald had blessed the harvest with words passed down through generations, thanking the gods for their bounty and asking for their protection through the coming winter. Young warriors had recited the deeds of their ancestors, keeping alive the stories that bound the clan to its proud history. Children had sung the old songs, their clear voices rising above the crackling of the fires. Now, as the formalities gave way to celebration, the hall filled with the easy warmth of a community at peace with itself. Warriors boasted of their training exploits, craftsmen displayed their finest work, and merchants shared tales from distant lands. The mead flowed freely, loosening tongues and lifting spirits as the night progressed. But not all seats were filled yet. Ragna had delayed her arrival, taking extra care with her appearance, and struggling with the familiar anxiety that accompanied any public gathering. She had chosen her best dress, a deep green wool that Magnus had always admired, and arranged her hair in the intricate braids befitting a woman of the clan. Yet as she approached the hall's entrance, her confidence wavered. The sound of laughter spilled out into the night, and with it came the weight of anticipation and dread. She knew what awaited her inside, the search for an empty seat, the awkward negotiations with those already seated, the whispered comments that followed in her wake. Still, she squared her shoulders and stepped through the doorway. The hall's warmth embraced her immediately, along with the rich sense of roasted meat and burning pine. For a moment, she stood in the entrance, overwhelmed by the sheer vitality of the scene before her. This was her clan, her people, and despite everything, she belonged here as much as anyone. Her eyes swept the long tables, searching for an open space. The benches were already crowded with clan members, their narrow construction forcing people to sit close together. She could see several spots that might accommodate her, but reaching them would require asking others to move. Drawing attention to herself and her needs, taking a deep breath, Ragna made her way toward a table near the center of the hall. A group of younger warriors sat there, flushed with mead and high spirits. She approached with quiet dignity, hoping to slip into the empty space at the table's end without causing too much disruption. "Excuse me," she said softly to the young man nearest the gap. "Might I sit here?" Bjorn Ironson looked up from his drinking horn, his eyes taking in Ragna's appearance with undisguised assessment. At 26, he was considered one of the clan's most promising warriors, his strength and skill earning him respect among his peers. But prosperity and praise had also bred in him a cruel streak, a need to establish his dominance through the diminishment of others. "I'm not sure there's room," he said loudly, his voice carrying farther than necessary. These benches were built for warriors, not— He let the sentence hang unfinished, but his meaning was clear. Several heads turned their way, drawn by the commotion. Ragna felt heat rise in her cheeks, but she maintained her composure. "I won't take much space," she replied, her voice steady despite the growing attention. Bjorn made a show of measuring the gap with his eyes, then shook his head with exaggerated regret. "I don't think so. Perhaps you could find somewhere more suitable?" His companions snickered, emboldened by their leader's cruelty. One of them, a red-haired youth named Eric, leaned forward with a malicious grin. "Maybe the kitchen has space," he suggested. "I'm sure there's a nice wide stool by the fire where you'd be more comfortable." The laughter that followed was sharp and cutting, designed to wound rather than amuse. More people were looking now, drawn by the spectacle of Ragna's humiliation. She stood frozen for a moment, caught between the desire to flee and the stubborn refusal to give them the satisfaction of her retreat. "Or perhaps," Bjorn continued, warming to his theme, "you could ask the stable master to bring in a hay bale. That might support your requirements better than our poor benches." The comment drew louder laughter from his table and uncomfortable chuckles from others nearby. Ragna felt the familiar sting of tears threatening, but she refused to let them fall. She had endured worse than this since Magnus's death, and she would endure this too, but as she prepared to turn away, to seek some darker corner where she might sit unnoticed, something extraordinary happened. A silence fell over the hall, starting from the high table and spreading like ripples across still water. Conversations died mid-sentence, laughter faded to nervous whispers, and every eye turned toward the front of the room. Ulfar had risen from his carved throne. The movement was unhurried, deliberate, carrying the weight of authority that had been built over decades of leadership. He stood tall and imposing, his pale eyes surveying the hall with quiet intensity. The wolf-skin cloak fell around his shoulders like the mantle of kingship, and in the dancing torchlight, he seemed less like a mortal man than a force of nature given human form. The silence stretched, becoming almost unbearable in its completeness. Even the crackling of the fires seemed muted, as if the very flames held their breath in anticipation. Bjorn's face had gone pale, his earlier bravado evaporating under the chieftain's steady gaze. Without a word, Ulfar stepped down from the raised platform where his table sat. His boots made soft sounds against the rush-covered floor as he walked, each step measured and purposeful. The crowd parted before him instinctively, creating a clear path through the center of the hall. He moved with the fluid grace of a predator, his hands relaxed at his sides, but his bearing suggesting coiled strength ready to spring into action. The old scar on his face caught the light, serving as a reminder of the violence he was capable of. Even as his expression remained calm and controlled, Ragna stood transfixed as the most powerful man in the settlement approached her. She had spoken to Ulfar many times over the years. He was not a distant ruler, but a leader who knew his people personally, yet she had never been the focus of his attention in such a public setting. The weight of every gaze in the hall pressed down upon her, and she felt exposed and vulnerable under the scrutiny. Ulfar reached her position and stopped, his eyes meeting hers with surprising gentleness. Up close, she could see the lines that years of responsibility had etched around his eyes, the subtle signs of the burdens he carried for his people. But there was kindness there too, a warmth that few were privileged to see. He extended his hand toward her in a gesture of unmistakable invitation, and the hall held its collective breath, waiting to see what would happen next. In that moment, suspended between silence and revelation, everything balanced on the edge of change. The moment stretched like a bowstring pulled taut. Every person in the hall frozen in anticipation of what would come next. Ulfar's outstretched hand remained steady, his pale eyes holding Ragna's gaze with quiet certainty. The torchlight played across his weathered features, revealing not anger or judgment, but something far more powerful, compassion made manifest through action. Ragna stared at the offered hand, her mind struggling to process what was happening. This was Ulfar Long-Mane, the chieftain who had led their clan through countless trials, whose word carried the weight of law and whose approval meant everything to their community. And he was reaching out to her, publicly, in front of everyone who had just witnessed her humiliation. "Come," he said simply, his voice carrying across the silent hall like a stone dropped into still water. The single word held no command, no force, only invitation. With trembling fingers, Ragna placed her hand in his. His grip was warm and steady, calloused from years of sword work, but gentle in its strength. The touch sent a shock of disbelief through her. When had anyone last offered her such kindness? Such public support? Ulfar turned, still holding her hand, and began walking toward the front of the hall. The crowd remained silent, too stunned to react, as their chieftain escorted the woman who had just been mocked to the place of highest honor. Ragna felt as if she were moving through a dream, her feet carrying her forward while her mind reeled with the impossibility of the situation. They reached the raised platform where Ulfar's table sat, distinguished from all others by its position and the quality of its furnishings. The carved high seat dominated the space, its bare-head decoration seeming to watch their approach with ancient wisdom. The wolfskin cushions gleamed in the firelight, soft and inviting, yet intimidating in their symbolic weight. Ulfar released her hand and gestured toward the throne with simple grace. "Please," he said, his voice carrying no hint of irony or performance. "Sit." Ragna's eyes widened in shock. "My lord, I cannot. This is your seat, your place of honor, and I offer it freely." Ulfar replied, his tone brooking no argument. "A chair is only wood and wool until someone worthy occupies it. Tonight, you honor the seat far more than it honors you." The words carried across the hall, clear and unambiguous. Ragna felt tears threaten again, but these were different from the ones that had come with humiliation. These spoke of gratitude so profound it seemed to overflow from her very soul. With careful dignity, she approached the great chair. The carved bears seemed less intimidating now, their fierce expressions somehow welcoming. She settled onto the wolfskin cushions, feeling their softness embrace her like a long-lost comfort. The height of the seat gave her a commanding view of the entire hall, and for the first time in years she felt truly seen rather than merely observed. Ulfar moved to stand beside the chair, his presence both protective and honoring. He made no move to find another seat, content to remain standing as if guarding something precious. The symbolism was unmistakable. The most powerful man in the settlement had given up his place of privilege to ensure that someone else felt worthy and welcomed. The hall began to stir from its stunned silence. Whispers rippled through the crowd, like wind through grain, carrying fragments of shock, admiration, and confusion. Some faces showed shame, as they recognized the contrast between their own behavior and their chieftain's example. Others displayed uncertainty, unsure how to react to such an unprecedented display. Bjorn sat frozen at his table, his face cycling through expressions of disbelief, anger, and growing fear. The young warrior had built his reputation on strength and aggression, but he found himself facing something he had never learned to combat: moral authority wielded with quiet certainty. His companions had gone silent, their earlier bravado evaporating like mist before the sun. At a table near the back, Astrid watched the scene unfold with fierce satisfaction. She had known Ulfar since he was a boy, had seen him grow from an impetuous young raider into a leader of genuine wisdom. This gesture, she realized, revealed the true measure of the man he had become. Her eyes caught Ragna's across the hall, and she nodded once in approval and encouragement. The feast began to resume its rhythm, though the atmosphere had changed completely. Servants approached the high table with nervous deference, unsure how to serve a guest who occupied the chieftain's seat. Ulfar directed them with calm authority, ensuring that Ragna received the finest portions of every dish, the best wine, the choicest selections from the evening's bounty. "I don't understand," Ragna whispered, her voice barely audible above the returning conversations. "Why would you do this? Why risk your standing for someone like me?" Ulfar's expression softened, and for a moment she caught a glimpse of something deeper. Old pain carefully contained, wisdom earned through loss. "Because strength isn't measured by who we can defeat," he replied quietly. "It's measured by who we choose to protect." As the evening progressed, something remarkable began to happen. One by one, clan members approached the high table to pay their respects. Not just to Ulfar, but to Ragna as well. They came with sheepish expressions and words of apology, some offering compliments on her dress or asking about her work at the docks. The change was subtle but unmistakable, as if Ulfar's gesture had given them permission to see her with new eyes. Magnus Thorson, an elderly craftsman respected throughout the settlement, was among the first to approach. He bowed slightly to both Ragna and Ulfar before speaking. "Ragna Eriksdotter," he said formally, "I have not properly thanked you for the fine fish you brought to market last week. My wife spoke of them for days." He paused, his weathered hands working nervously at his belt. "I fear some of us have forgotten that worth is measured by deeds, not appearance." Ragna felt warmth spread through her chest at the genuine respect in his voice. "Thank you, Magnus. Your words mean more than you know." Others followed, women who had kept their distance since her widowhood, men who had nodded politely but never truly engaged, young people who had been influenced by their elders' subtle dismissals. Each interaction built upon the last, creating a foundation of renewed respect that had been missing from her life for far too long. The evening's earlier cruelty began to feel like something from another world, replaced by a warmth that had nothing to do with the fires blazing along the walls. Ragna found herself relaxing into the carved seat, her natural confidence beginning to resurface as she engaged in conversations that treated her as an equal rather than an object of pity or scorn. Yet even as she basked in this unexpected acceptance, she couldn't help but notice the shadows that lingered at the edges of the celebration. Bjorn and his companions remained subdued, their eyes occasionally flicking toward the high table with expressions of resentment. Not everyone approved of Ulfar's gesture, and she sensed that tonight's events would have consequences that extended far beyond the walls of the great hall. For now, though, she allowed herself to enjoy this moment of dignity restored. Beside her, Ulfar continued to stand with quiet pride, his presence a constant reminder that kindness could be its own form of strength, and that true leadership sometimes meant giving up power to lift others higher. As the feast continued, the great hall settled into a new rhythm, though an undercurrent of tension still pulsed beneath the surface conversations. Ragna sat in the carved throne with growing ease, her initial shock giving way to a quiet dignity that seemed to emanate from the chair itself. The bare heads carved into its arms no longer seemed intimidating but protective, as if ancient guardians had awakened to watch over her. Around her wrist, barely visible beneath her sleeve, lay a thin band of silver, her wedding bracelet, worn smooth by years of faithful wearing. Magnus had placed it there on their wedding day, whispering that it would keep them connected across any distance. She had never removed it, even during the darkest days after his death, when its weight seemed to mock her loneliness. Tonight, for the first time in 3 years, it felt like a comfort rather than a burden. The memory of that wedding day came flooding back with startling clarity. She had been 22 then, strong and confident, her laughter echoing through this very hall as she danced with Magnus until dawn. Her body had been lean and powerful, shaped by years of working alongside her father on his fishing boat. She had commanded respect not just for her beauty, but for her skill with nets and her ability to read the moods of the sea. Those had been golden days, when she and Magnus dreamed of the children they would raise, and the life they would build together. The future had stretched before them like calm waters under summer sun, full of promise and possibility. She had never imagined that 20 years later she would be sitting alone at feast tables, bearing the weight of grief in her body and scorn in others' eyes. Ulfar moved to serve her himself, an act so unprecedented that several nearby conversations faltered into silence. He filled her horn with the finest mead, ensuring she received the choicest portions of roasted meat and fresh bread. His actions spoke louder than any words could. This was not mere charity, but a declaration that she deserved the very best his hall could offer. "Tell me about your morning's catch," he said, settling into easy conversation as naturally as if they sat by her own hearth rather than before the entire clan. "I heard you brought in quite a haul despite the rough waters." Ragna felt a flush of pride at the question. Her work was one of the few areas where grief had not diminished her abilities. If anything, the long hours on the water had become a refuge where she could lose herself in familiar tasks. "The storm drove the fish deeper," she explained, her voice growing stronger as she spoke of something she understood completely. "Most of the boats turned back when the waves grew high, but I know a sheltered cove where the current runs just right. The fish school there when they're seeking calmer water." "And you went alone into those waves?" asked Helga Rolfstuttir, an older woman who had approached the high table with her husband. Her tone held genuine admiration rather than the subtle criticism Ragna had grown accustomed to hearing. "I've been fishing these waters since I was 12, Ragna replied with quiet confidence. "The sea and I understand each other well enough." Ulfar smiled at her response, and she caught something in his expression that made her heart skip. Not attraction, exactly, but recognition. He saw her competence, her strength, the qualities that others overlooked when they focused only on her changed appearance. Magnus used to say, "You could read the water better than any fisherman in the settlement," Ulfar continued. "He was proud of your skill." The mention of her husband's name sent a bittersweet pang through her chest, but for once it was tinged with warmth rather than pure sorrow. "He taught me patience," she said softly. "Said the sea rewards those who listen more than those who demand." "Wise words," Ulfar agreed. "Perhaps that's a lesson we could all learn." His comment carried weight beyond its surface meaning, and several nearby listeners shifted uncomfortably. The contrast between his respectful attention to Ragna and their own earlier dismissal was becoming increasingly apparent. Not everyone was pleased with the evening's turn of events. From his table across the hall, Bjorn watched the interactions at the high seat with growing resentment. The young warrior's pride had been wounded by Ulfar's implicit rebuke, and his ale-clouded mind was already spinning the incident into a narrative of weakness and poor judgment. "Look at him," Bjorn muttered to his companions, his voice low but carrying enough to reach nearby tables. "Fawning over her like she's some great lady instead of a fishwife who's let herself go." Eric, emboldened by drink and his leader's obvious displeasure, leaned closer. "My father says Ulfar's gotten too soft since he stopped raiding. Maybe age is making him sentimental." "Sentimental," Bjorn repeated, testing the word like a weapon. That's exactly what it is. When did we start rewarding weakness instead of strength? Their words began to spread, carried by whispers and meaningful glances to others who shared their discomfort with the evening's events. A faction was forming, subtle but unmistakable, united by the belief that their chieftain was showing poor judgment, Astrid, ever alert to the currents of gossip that flowed through any gathering. Noticed the shift in mood with growing concern. She had positioned herself where she could observe both the high table and the rest of the hall, and what she saw troubled her deeply. Ulfar's gesture, beautiful as it was, had created ripples that might prove dangerous for both him and Ragna. She caught Ragna's eye and offered an encouraging smile, but beneath her expression lay worry. Astrid understood the politics of small communities better than most. Acts of kindness, however well-intentioned, could sometimes create more problems than they solved. Those who felt shamed by another's virtue often sought to restore their self-regard by tearing down the example that highlighted their own shortcomings. As the evening progressed, the division in the hall became more pronounced. Those who approached the high table did so with genuine respect and warmth, engaging Ragna in conversations that acknowledged her worth and contributions. But an equal number kept their distance, their discomfort with the situation manifesting in pointed silences and disapproving glances. Ulfar remained standing beside the throne throughout the feast, his presence both protective and honoring. He shared stories that included Ragna in the conversation, asked her opinions on matters of settlement business, and treated her with the courtesy due to an honored guest. His behavior sent a clear message about how he expected others to treat her, but it also revealed something deeper about his own character. In the warm glow of the torchlight, with the carved bears watching over her and the finest mead warming her blood, Ragna began to remember what it felt like to be valued for more than her productivity or pitied for her losses. The silver bracelet around her wrist no longer felt like a chain binding her to the past, but like a bridge connecting who she had been to who she might yet become. Yet even as she basked in this unexpected warmth, she could sense the undercurrents of resentment flowing through parts of the hall. Ulfar's kindness had given her a glimpse of dignity restored, but she was wise enough to know that not all gifts came without a price. The real test would come not tonight, in the warmth of the feast hall, but in the cold light of tomorrow's dawn. 3 days had passed since the harvest feast, and the settlement had settled into its familiar rhythms, though subtle changes rippled beneath the surface like currents in still water. Ragna found herself walking taller as she made her way to the docks each morning, her shoulders no longer hunched against the weight of expected scorn. The memory of Ulfar's gesture had given her something she had thought lost forever, a sense of her own worth that came not from others' approval, but from within. The morning mist clung to the fjord surface as she prepared her boat for another day's fishing. Her movements were sure and practiced, the result of decades spent reading wind and water. She had always taken pride in her work, but now that pride felt validated rather than defensive. Several younger fishermen had approached her over the past few days, asking for advice about tides and weather patterns with a respect that would have seemed impossible a week ago. As she checked her nets for tiers and weak spots, footsteps approached along the wooden dock. She looked up to see Ulfar himself walking toward her, his long stride eating up the distance between them. The sight of the chieftain at the working docks was unusual enough to draw stares from the other fishermen, but he seemed oblivious to the attention. "Good morning, Ragna," he called as he drew near. "I hope you don't mind some company." "Of course not, my lord," she replied, though surprise colored her voice. "What brings you to the docks so early?" Ulfar's scarred face held a rueful expression as he gestured toward her boat. "I realized I've spent so many years managing the settlement that I've forgotten what it actually takes to feed it. Would you teach me something about fishing?" The request was so unexpected that Ragna nearly dropped the net she was mending. "You want to learn fishing? But surely you have more important. Nothing is more important than understanding the work my people do," Ulfar interrupted gently. How can I lead them properly if I don't know what they face each day? His words carried the weight of genuine curiosity, and Ragna found herself nodding. Very well. But I warn you, the work is harder than it looks, and the sea doesn't care about your rank. A smile touched Ulfar's lips, the first truly relaxed expression she had seen from him. I'm counting on that. I could use some time where my only concern is the task at hand. They worked together through the morning, Ulfar proving surprisingly adept at taking direction. His warrior's reflexes served him well as he learned to handle the nets, and his years of command had taught him the value of listening carefully to those with greater expertise. Ragna found herself falling into the role of teacher with growing confidence, her knowledge and experience finally receiving the recognition they deserved. The trick, she explained as they hauled in a net heavy with silver fish, is reading the signs the sea gives you. The color of the water, the way the birds move, even the smell of the wind. They all tell you where the fish are likely to be. Ulfar nodded thoughtfully, his pale eyes scanning the horizon with new appreciation. It's not unlike reading a battlefield, I suppose, watching for the small details that tell you what's really happening beneath the surface. As he spoke, Ragna noticed the way his hand unconsciously moved to touch his left cheek, fingers tracing the line of the old scar that ran from temple to jaw. The mark was prominent but not disfiguring, cutting across his weathered features like a reminder of battles long past. She had wondered about its origin since childhood but had never dared ask. That scar, she said softly, emboldened by the intimacy of their shared work. Was it from a raid? Ulfar's hand stilled against his face, and for a moment she thought she had overstepped. But then he nodded slowly, his expression growing distant. Ironically, it was from the raid that taught me the futility of violence, he said. We attacked a coastal settlement much like this one, thinking we were claiming glory and wealth. But what we found were people just like us, fishermen, craftsmen, families, trying to survive another winter. His voice carried old pain, carefully contained but still sharp enough to cut. A young defender, barely more than a boy, managed to mark me with his blade before I struck him down. As he lay dying, he looked at me with such confusion, as if he couldn't understand why we had come to destroy his home. Ragna felt her breath catch. She had heard stories of Ulfar's raiding days, but they had always been told with admiration for his prowess and success. This glimpse of the cost, both to others and to himself, revealed depths she had never suspected. That night, as I sat by our campfire counting the day's plunder, I realized I had become something I didn't recognize. Ulfar continued. The scar healed, but the memory of that boy's eyes never did. I swore then that I would find better ways to protect my people than by destroying others. They worked in comfortable silence for a while, the weight of his confession settling between them like a bridge built of shared understanding. Ragna had always known that Ulfar was different from other warriors, but now she began to comprehend the journey that had shaped him into the leader he had become. As the sun climbed higher, other fishermen began to notice the unusual partnership. Some watched with curiosity, others with growing disapproval. Word would spread quickly through the settlement, the chieftain spending his morning learning common work from the widow who had been mocked just days before. Among those watching with particular interest was young Bjorn, who had come to the docks ostensibly to check on his family's trading boat. His face darkened as he observed Ulfar deferring to Ragna's expertise, taking instruction from her as if she were a respected elder rather than a target of recent mockery. Look at that, he muttered to his companion Eric, who had accompanied him. Our great leader, taking lessons from a fishwife. What's next? Will he ask the stable boys to teach him strategy? Eric nodded with uncomfortable enthusiasm, though part of him couldn't help but notice how efficiently Ragna and Ulfar worked together, their coordination speaking of genuine skill and mutual respect. Still, Bjorn's words planted seeds of doubt that would grow in the days to come. When the morning's work was done and their catch secured, Ulfar helped Ragna carry the heavy nets back to the dock. His hands, more accustomed to sword hilts than fishing gear, showed the pink marks of honest labor, and there was satisfaction in his expression that spoke of work well done. "Thank you," he said as they finished storing the equipment. "This morning has taught me more than just fishing techniques." "And what's that?" Ragna asked, though she thought she already knew the answer. "That strength comes in many forms," Ulfar replied, "and that sometimes the most valuable lessons come from those we overlook." As he walked back toward the great hall, Ragna watched him go with a mixture of gratitude and growing concern. Ulfar's kindness was transforming her life in ways she had never dared hope, but she was beginning to understand that such transformation might come at a cost to them both. The whispers were already starting, the questions about his judgment and fitness to lead. She could only hope that the man who had taught her about her own worth would not pay too high a price for that generosity. The afternoon sun streamed through the windows of Ulfar's dwelling as Ragna hesitantly approached the carved wooden door. She had come to return a fishing hook he had accidentally taken with him that morning, but her real reason was curiosity about the man who had shown her such unexpected kindness. The chieftain's home sat apart from the other buildings, modest in size, but built with the finest craftsmanship the settlement could offer. Ulfar opened the door at her knock, his face brightening with genuine pleasure at seeing her. "Ragna, come in, please. I was just preparing some tea. Would you join me?" She stepped across the threshold into a space that surprised her with its simplicity. She had expected something grand, befitting a chieftain's status, but instead found a comfortable home that spoke of a man who valued function over display. The main room was warm and inviting, with well-made furniture arranged around a central hearth where a fire crackled softly. What caught her attention immediately, however, was not what was present but what was absent. The walls held spaces where things had clearly once hung, lighter patches in the wood that spoke of removed decorations, empty pegs that had once held personal items. It was as if parts of the home's history had been carefully erased, leaving only the essential elements behind. "Please sit," Ulfar said, gesturing toward a comfortable chair near the fire. "I'll fetch the tea." As he moved toward the kitchen area, Ragna's eyes continued to explore the room. On a shelf near the window, almost hidden behind a collection of scrolls and practical items, sat a small wooden toy ship. The carving was exquisite, painted in bright blues and reds that had faded with age and handling. Tiny figures could be seen on its deck, and the attention to detail spoke of hours spent in careful creation. The toy was clearly old, worn smooth in places by small hands that had once cherished it. It seemed oddly out of place in the home of a bachelor chieftain, yet it had been positioned where it could catch the morning light, suggesting it held significance beyond mere decoration. Ulfar returned with 2 steaming cups, following her gaze to the little ship. His face went still for a moment, and she saw him struggle with some internal decision before setting down the tea and moving to the shelf. "My daughter made this," he said quietly, lifting the toy with careful reverence. "Well, I helped with the carving, but she chose the colors and painted every detail herself. She was 7. The past tense hung in the air like a weight, and Ragna felt her heart clench with sudden understanding. She had known that Ulfar had once been married, but the settlement gossips had never spoken of children. Now she understood why. The pain of such loss was too profound for casual conversation. "She was beautiful," Ulfar continued, his weathered fingers tracing the ship's painted hull. "Bright as summer lightning, with her mother's laugh and enough curiosity to fill the fjord. She wanted to be a sea captain when she grew up, to sail beyond the horizon and discover new lands." He set the toy back in its place of honor and returned to his chair. But Ragna could see that the simple act of sharing this memory had cost him something. His hands trembled slightly as he lifted his teacup, and the old scar on his face seemed more pronounced in the flickering firelight. "What happened to them?" she asked gently, though she dreaded the answer. "Raiders," Ulfar said simply. "Not unlike what I had once been myself. They came in the night while I was away, negotiating with a neighboring clan. My wife Ingrid tried to hide our daughter Astrid in the root cellar, but his voice broke, and he set down his cup with careful precision. They found them anyway. The raiders took what they wanted and burned the rest. When I returned, there was nothing left but ashes and silence. Ragna felt tears spring to her eyes, understanding now the source of the pain she had glimpsed in Ulfar's expression. The loss of a spouse was devastating, but the loss of a child was a wound that never truly healed. "I'm so sorry," she whispered, the words feeling inadequate against such profound grief. "I went mad for a while," Ulfar continued, his voice barely above a whisper. "Spent 3 years hunting the men who killed them, tracking them across half the known world. I became everything I had sworn to leave behind. Ruthless, cold, consumed by thoughts of revenge." He looked up at her then, and she saw in his eyes the echo of that ancient fury, carefully contained, but never fully extinguished. "When I finally found the last of them, I realized that killing him wouldn't bring my family back. It would only create more orphans, more widows, more empty homes. That's when I truly understood what I had to do." "Come home," Ragna said softly, understanding the weight of that decision. "Come home and try to build something worth protecting." Ulfar agreed. "To become the kind of leader who prevents such tragedies rather than causing them." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, each lost in their own memories of loss and the long journey back from despair. Ragna thought of her own dark period after Magnus's death, the way grief had twisted her perception of herself and her place in the world. But where her loss had driven her into isolation, Ulfar's had ultimately led him toward greater compassion. "Is that why you stood up for me?" she asked eventually. "Because you know what it feels like to be broken by loss?" Ulfar considered her question carefully before answering. "Partly, perhaps, but mostly because I've learned to see people as they truly are, not as they appear to be. You carry your grief in your body, but your spirit remains strong. That strength deserves recognition, not mockery." His words warmed her more than the fire or the tea, reaching places in her heart that had been cold for far too long. "The settlement doesn't see it that way. Many think you're showing poor judgment by treating me with such kindness." "Let them think what they will," Ulfar replied, though she caught a flicker of concern in his expression. "A leader who bases his decisions on popular opinion is no leader at all." Even as he spoke the words, they both knew the situation was more complicated than his brave declaration suggested. Leadership, particularly in a small community like theirs, required a delicate balance between personal conviction and political reality. Ulfar's gesture at the feast had been noble, but it had also created ripples that continued to spread through the settlement. As evening approached, Ragna prepared to leave, but she found herself reluctant to abandon the warmth and understanding she had found in this simple room. Ulfar's willingness to share his deepest pain had created a bond between them that went beyond mere friendship or sympathy. They were two people who had survived profound loss and found ways to continue living with purpose and dignity. "Thank you," she said as he walked her to the door. "For the tea, for the conversation, for everything. Thank you for listening," Ulfar replied. "It's been years since I spoke of them. I had forgotten how healing it could be to share their memory with someone who understands." As she walked home through the gathering dusk, Ragna carried with her a new understanding of the man who had changed her life with a single gesture of kindness. But she also carried a growing worry about the price he might pay for that generosity, and the forces already gathering against his leadership style in their small, tradition-bound community. The morning that would change everything began with deceptive calm. A merchant ship had been spotted on the horizon the night before, and the settlement buzzed with anticipation of news from distant lands and goods for trade. Ragna had risen early to prepare her best catch for the visiting traders, hoping to secure good prices for her fish while the merchants still had coin to spend. But as she worked at the docks, she noticed unusual activity around the great hall. Warriors moved with purpose between the buildings, their hands resting casually on their weapon hilts in the way that suggested readiness for trouble rather than routine patrol. The air held a tension that made her skin prickle with unease, Bjorn Aronson strode past the docks with 3 of his closest companions, his face set in grim lines of determination. In his hand, he carried what appeared to be a piece of parchment, edges blackened as if it had been rescued from fire. The young warrior's jaw was tight with barely controlled anger, and his eyes held the gleam of someone who believed he carried important information. "Bjorn," called old Henrik from the next dock over. "What brings you down here with such a dark expression?" "Important business," Bjorn replied curtly. "Business that affects the safety of every man, woman and child in this settlement." His words carried farther than necessary, drawing the attention of other fishermen and dock workers. Ragna felt a chill that had nothing to do with the morning air. Something was wrong, and her instincts told her it involved more than simple merchant trading. Bjorn and his men disappeared into the great hall, and within minutes the sound of raised voices could be heard even at this distance. Not the comfortable argument of men debating trade terms, but the sharp exchanges of serious disagreement. Ragna found herself edging closer to the hall, drawn by curiosity and growing concern. Inside the great hall, Ulfar stood before his carved throne, his face a mask of controlled patience as Bjorn presented his case. The burned parchment lay on the table between them, its charred edges giving it an ominous appearance in the morning light that streamed through the windows. "This message was meant for you," Bjorn declared, his voice ringing with righteous indignation. "I intercepted it when the messenger's horse threw him just outside our borders. He dropped this and fled before I could question him properly." Ulfar picked up the parchment carefully, his experienced eyes scanning the partially legible text. What he read made his blood run cold, not with fear, but with the terrible understanding of what Bjorn was attempting to orchestrate. The message, though damaged by fire, was clear enough in its essential details. A group of displaced families was approaching their settlement, refugees from a coastal raid that had destroyed their homes. They carried few weapons and fewer supplies, seeking shelter and the chance to rebuild their lives in peaceful surroundings. The message was a request for sanctuary, not a declaration of war, but Bjorn had presented it to the gathered warriors as evidence of an impending attack. "Raiders," Bjorn continued, his voice pitched to carry to every corner of the hall. "A full war party, according to this message. They approach under the pretense of peaceful intent, but we all know how such deceptions work. They expect to find us unprepared, our guard down because of their false claims of seeking shelter." Several of the younger warriors nodded grimly, their hands moving to their weapons. The older men looked more skeptical, but uncertainty was written across their faces. In a world where survival often depended on quick decisions and decisive action, the possibility of threat demanded serious consideration. Ulfar studied the message again, noting details that Bjorn had either missed or deliberately ignored. The handwriting was shaky, desperate, the work of someone writing in haste and fear. The language spoke of children and elderly among the refugees, of families torn apart by violence and seeking nothing more than safety. This was not the communication of raiders planning an attack. "Bjorn," Ulfar said carefully, "are you certain of your interpretation? This message speaks of families, of those seeking shelter after losing their homes." "Exactly what they would want us to believe," Bjorn countered. "My lord, with respect, your recent—" He paused, choosing his words with calculated precision. "Your recent displays of misplaced sympathy suggest that your judgment may be clouded by sentiment rather than guided by wisdom." The accusation hung in the air like smoke from a poorly tended fire. Every person in the hall understood that Bjorn was referring to Ulfar's treatment of Ragna, using that gesture of kindness as evidence of weakness that compromised his ability to lead in times of crisis. "I see refugees seeking help," Ulfar replied evenly. "You see raiders planning deception. One of us is wrong, and the consequences of that error could be severe either way. Then let us prepare for the worst and hope for the best," suggested Eric, emboldened by Bjorn's lead. "If they truly are refugees, our readiness will harm no one. If they are raiders, Our preparation could save lives. It was a reasonable argument on the surface, but Ulfar recognized the trap it contained. Once weapons were drawn and warriors positioned for battle, the expectation of conflict became a self-fulfilling prophecy. Fear and suspicion would poison any chance of peaceful resolution, turning potential allies into enemies through the very act of treating them as threats. Outside the hall, Ragna had managed to position herself near a window where she could hear the increasingly heated discussion. Her heart sank as she realized what was happening. Bjorn was using the arrival of strangers to challenge Ulfar's leadership, and her presence in the chieftain's life had given him the perfect ammunition. The burned letter in Bjorn's hands told a different story than the one he was spinning, even from her limited vantage point. She could see enough of the parchment to recognize the desperate scrawl of someone seeking help, not planning harm. But Bjorn's interpretation was gaining support among warriors who had been primed to see their leader's compassion as dangerous weakness. As she watched, more clan members entered the hall, drawn by word of the crisis. The mood was shifting toward acceptance of Bjorn's version of events, influenced by his confident presentation and the underlying doubts that had been growing since the harvest feast. Ulfar's gesture of kindness toward her was being weaponized against him, transformed from nobility into evidence of poor judgment. The irony was bitter and sharp. The same compassion that had restored her dignity was now being used to undermine the man who had shown it. Every act of kindness Ulfar had performed, every moment of consideration he had demonstrated, was being reframed as proof that he had grown soft and unreliable in matters of serious import. Inside the hall, the debate continued with increasing intensity. More warriors spoke in favor of preparation for battle, their voices mixing fear with excitement at the prospect of action. The peaceful settlement that Ulfar had worked so hard to build was teetering on the edge of violence, pushed toward conflict by manipulation and misrepresentation. Bjorn's strategy was becoming clear. By positioning himself as the voice of strength and decisive action, he was creating a contrast with Ulfar's more measured approach. In the minds of those who valued traditional warrior virtues above all else, Bjorn appeared to be the leader their clan needed, while Ulfar seemed dangerously compromised by sentiment and weakness. The burned letter remained on the table between them, its truth obscured by charred edges and deliberate misinterpretation. What should have been a plea for help had become a weapon in a power struggle, and the lives of innocent refugees hung in the balance of a young warrior's ambition. Ragna realized, with growing horror, that she had become an unwitting catalyst for this crisis. Her very existence as the recipient of Ulfar's kindness had provided Bjorn with the evidence he needed to question their leader's fitness for command. Every gesture of respect Ulfar had shown her, every moment of dignity he had restored, was now being used as proof that he could no longer be trusted to make the hard decisions that leadership required. As the voices in the hall grew louder and more contentious, she understood that the approaching refugees were not the only ones in danger. Ulfar's position as chieftain was under direct assault, and the weapon being used against him was the very compassion that had made him a leader worth following. The burned letter held secrets that could change everything, but only if someone was brave enough to speak the truth it contained. The question was whether anyone would be willing to risk everything to ensure that truth was heard before. It was too late. The tension in the great hall had reached a breaking point when Ragna slipped through the side door, her heart pounding with the weight of what she had witnessed. The burned letter's true meaning blazed in her mind like a beacon, but she knew that simply speaking the truth might not be enough to prevent the disaster that Bjorn was orchestrating. She needed proof, and she needed allies. Moving quickly through the settlement, she made her way to Astrid's dwelling. Her friend was outside, hanging freshly washed clothes on a line stretched between two posts. But her movements were distracted, her attention clearly focused on the sounds of argument drifting from the great hall. "Astrid," Ragna called softly, approaching with urgent steps. "I need your help. Something terrible is happening." Astrid dropped the shirt she was hanging and turned with immediate concern. "I've been hearing the shouting." "What's going on in there?" Ragna quickly explained what she had overheard, describing Bjorn's manipulation of the burned letter and his use of her relationship with Ulfar as evidence of compromised leadership. As she spoke, Astrid's expression grew increasingly grim. "That ambitious fool," Astrid muttered. "I've been watching him gather supporters among the younger warriors. He's been poisoning minds for weeks, using your presence at the high table as proof that Ulfar has lost his edge." "Then you'll help me?" Ragnar asked. "We need to get word to Ulfar about what that letter really says before it's too late." "Of course I'll help," Astrid replied without hesitation. "But we need to be clever about this. If we simply walk into that hall and contradict Bjorn publicly, we'll be dismissed as women meddling in warriors' business. We need a different approach." While they spoke in hurried whispers, the situation in the great hall continued to deteriorate. Ulfar stood before his throne, no longer seated in the carved chair that had once symbolized his unquestioned authority. In his hands, he held his father's shield, a massive round piece of iron-bossed oak that had protected 3 generations of chieftains before him. The shield was more than a weapon. It was a legacy, passed down from father to son, along with the burden of leadership. Its surface bore the scars of countless battles, each mark a testament to the courage and sacrifice of those who had carried it before. Now, as Ulfar gripped its worn leather handles, he felt the weight of all those who had stood where he stood, facing impossible choices with the welfare of their people hanging in the balance. "My father carried this shield in the great battle at Raven's Hollow," Ulfar said, his voice cutting through the contentious babble of the hall. "His father bore it when the sea-wolves came from the north. Each of them faced moments when they had to choose between the old ways and the new, between the familiar path of violence and the uncertain road of wisdom." The warriors fell silent, recognizing the solemnity of the moment. The shield commanded respect that transcended political divisions, representing a continuity of leadership that stretched back to the clan's founding. "Bjorn speaks of strength," Ulfar continued, his pale eyes moving across the assembled faces. "He believes that preparing for war is the only way to protect our people. But I have learned something in my years of leadership. Sometimes the greatest strength lies in choosing not to fight." "Pretty words," Bjorn replied, his voice sharp with challenge. "But words won't protect us if those ships carry armed raiders intent on our destruction. Will you stake the lives of our children on your hope that strangers mean us no harm?" It was a masterful rhetorical trap. By framing the choice as one between the safety of their own people and Ulfar's naive optimism, Bjorn had positioned himself as the defender of common sense against dangerous idealism. Several warriors nodded in agreement, their faces showing the influence of his carefully chosen words. Outside the hall, ships had appeared on the horizon, 3 small vessels riding low in the water, their approach slow and careful rather than aggressive. Through his spyglass, the settlement's lookout could see crowded decks and what appeared to be makeshift shelters rigged from spare canvas. These were not the lean warships of raiders, but the overloaded boats of people carrying everything they owned. But Bjorn had anticipated this observation. "Of course they appear peaceful," he declared when the lookout's report reached the hall. "Deception is their greatest weapon. They want us to lower our guard, to welcome them into our very homes before they reveal their true intentions." The logic was seductive in its simplicity. Any evidence that contradicted Bjorn's narrative could be explained away as part of an elaborate ruse. The approaching strangers' apparent desperation became proof of their cunning, their obvious suffering evidence of their determination to succeed in their deception. Ulfar felt the support of his people slipping away like sand through his fingers. Years of careful leadership, of building trust and demonstrating wisdom, were being undone by fear and the persuasive voice of a young warrior who had never faced the true consequences of violence. The shield in his hands seemed to grow heavier with each passing moment, weighted down by the difficulty of the choice before him. Meanwhile, Ragna and Astrid had positioned themselves near the hall's main entrance, waiting for the right moment to act. They had decided that direct confrontation would be futile. Instead, they would need to create an opportunity for truth to emerge naturally. "Look," Astrid whispered, pointing toward the harbor. "The ships are close enough now to see clearly. Those aren't war vessels." Ragna strained her eyes against the morning glare and saw what her friend meant. The approaching boats were indeed overloaded with people and possessions, their occupants clearly visible as families rather than warriors. Children could be seen among the crowds on deck, and the elderly sat hunched under makeshift shelters. This was not an invasion force, but a desperate exodus. Inside the hall, the debate had reached a crucial moment. Bjorn was calling for an immediate vote of confidence in Ulfar's leadership, claiming that the approaching crisis demanded decisive action from someone willing to make hard choices. "Those who stand with strength and wisdom, stand with me," Bjorn declared, moving to the center of the hall where all could see him. "Those who prefer sentiment and weakness may continue to follow a leader whose judgment has been compromised by misplaced kindness." The reference to Ulfar's treatment of Ragna was unmistakable, and several warriors shifted uncomfortably. The gesture that had seemed noble at the harvest feast was now being reframed as evidence of poor decision-making, proof that their chieftain could no longer separate personal feelings from political necessity. Ulfar felt the moment slipping away from him. The shield that had once symbolized his authority now felt like a burden from a bygone age, a relic of times when leadership meant the willingness to fight rather than the wisdom to seek peace. He could see doubt growing in the eyes of warriors who had once followed him without question. "Very well," Ulfar said quietly, his voice carrying clearly in the tense silence. "If you question my fitness to lead, then let us put it to the test. But not through words and accusations, through action." He raised his father's shield higher, its iron boss catching the light from the torches along the walls. "I propose we meet these strangers at the shore. If they prove to be the raiders Bjorn claims, then let him lead our defense. But if they are truly refugees seeking aid, then perhaps we should reconsider who among us shows the greater wisdom." The proposal sent a ripple of surprise through the assembled crowd. It was a dangerous gamble, one that could cost Ulfar not just his leadership, but potentially his life, if Bjorn's interpretation proved correct. Yet it also offered the only path forward that might preserve both the approaching strangers and the unity of the clan. Bjorn's face flushed with triumph. This was exactly the opportunity he had been maneuvering toward, a chance to prove his worth through action while demonstrating Ulfar's unfitness for command. "Agreed," he said loudly. "Let all see who truly serves this clan's interests." As the warriors began to move toward the harbor, weapons in hand and tension crackling between them like lightning before a storm, Ragna knew that the moment of truth was approaching. The burned letter still held its secrets, and somewhere among the approaching refugees were people whose lives depended on those secrets being revealed. She looked at Astrid, seeing her own determination reflected in her friend's eyes. Whatever happened next would determine not just the fate of the strangers on those crowded ships, but the future direction of their entire community. The choice between fear and compassion, between the old ways of violence and the new path of wisdom, would be decided on the shores of the fjord where their ancestors had first made their home. The shield in Ulfar's hands represented the weight of that choice, and as the clan moved toward the harbor, it would soon become clear whether that ancient symbol of protection would be raised in welcome or wielded in unnecessary war. The procession to the harbor moved with grim purpose, warriors flanking Ulfar and Bjorn as the two leaders walked side by side toward what might be their final confrontation. The morning air carried the salt tang of the sea and the weight of impending decision, while behind them the entire settlement followed in tense anticipation. In Bjorn's hands, he carried the horn of calling, an ancient instrument carved from the tusk of a great whale, its surface polished smooth by generations of use. The horn held the power to summon the clan to war or welcome visitors in peace, its voice carrying across the fjord like the call of the gods themselves. For 300 years, only the chieftain or his designated champion had been permitted to sound its call, making it one of the most sacred artifacts of their people. But now Bjorn held it as if it were already his by right, his grip confident and his bearing proud. He had positioned himself as the voice of strength and decisiveness, and many of the younger warriors looked to him with growing respect. The horn in his hands seemed to validate his claim to leadership, suggesting that the old ways of command were already shifting in his favor. "When those ships beach," Bjorn said loudly enough for all to hear, "you'll see the truth of what approaches us. Raiders dressed as refugees, weapons hidden beneath children's blankets, death disguised as desperation." His words carried the ring of certainty, and several warriors nodded grimly. The psychology was effective. By predicting specific deceptions, Bjorn was priming his followers to see threats even in the most innocent appearances. A child's cry would become a signal. An elderly person's bent posture would hide a concealed blade, and any plea for mercy would be dismissed as calculated manipulation. Ulfar walked in silence, his father's shield held loosely at his side. The ancient weapon felt heavier with each step, not from its physical weight, but from the burden of the choice it represented. He could feel the doubt radiating from some of his followers, the way their loyalty had been shaken by weeks of subtle undermining and the clever manipulation of his kindness toward Ragna. As they reached the shore, the approaching ships became clearly visible in their full detail. 3 overcrowded vessels rode low in the choppy waters, their hulls battered and their sails patched with whatever materials their occupants had been able to find. The boats moved slowly, not with the swift aggression of raiders, but with the careful navigation of people pushing their vessels beyond safe limits. On the decks, families huddled together under makeshift shelters. Children pressed against the rails with wide, curious eyes, while their parents watched the approaching shore with expressions of desperate hope. An elderly woman could be seen tending to what appeared to be a sick person, lying on a pile of blankets. Her movements gentle and caring rather than threatening. "Look at them," Ulfar said quietly, his voice carrying only to those closest to him. "Look with your eyes, not your fears." But Bjorn was ready for this moment. "Clever," he acknowledged with grudging admiration. "They've even brought genuine families to make their deception more convincing. The best lies always contain elements of truth." The lead ship was close enough now that individual faces could be distinguished. A man stood at the bow, his clothes simple and travel-stained, his posture that of someone seeking permission rather than demanding entry. In his hands, he held no weapon but a white cloth, the universal symbol of peaceful intent. "He signals for parley," observed one of the older warriors, his voice uncertain. "Of course he does," Bjorn replied dismissively. "Would you expect raiders to announce their intentions openly? They want to get close enough to beach their ships and disembark their forces." The moment of decision had arrived. The boats were near enough to the shore that their occupants could hear any signal given, and the clan warriors were positioned along the beach like a line of judgment. Everything balanced on what happened next: the lives of the refugees, the future of Ulfar's leadership, and the very soul of the community they had all sworn to protect. Ulfar stepped forward, feeling the weight of generations of leadership pressing down upon his shoulders. His father had faced similar moments, times when the choice between war and peace hung on a single decision. His grandfather before him had stood on these same shores, deciding whether strangers would be welcomed or driven away. Now it was his turn to carry that burden. Bjorn moved to intercept him, the horn of calling raised to his lips. "Stand aside, Ulfar, your time is past. Let someone with the strength to protect this clan make the choice that must be made." The challenge was direct and unmistakable. In front of the entire settlement, Bjorn was openly claiming the right to lead, to speak for the clan, to determine whether the approaching strangers would find sanctuary or sword point. The horn at his lips represented not just a call to action, but a seizure of power that could reshape everything. "The horn has not been yours to carry for 3 centuries, Ulfar said, his voice calm but carrying an edge of steel. And it will not be yours to sound today. He stepped closer to Bjorn, his hand extending toward the ancient instrument. The two men faced each other on the shore, representatives of different philosophies of leadership. While behind them, the clan watched in tense silence, and before them, the refugee ships drew ever closer to the moment of truth. The tension on the shore reached a breaking point as Ulfar and Bjorn faced each other, the horn of calling suspended between them like a bridge across an impossible chasm. Behind them, the entire clan held its collective breath, while before them, the refugee ships continued their slow approach toward the beach. Bjorn's grip on the horn tightened, his knuckles white with determination. "You've lost the respect of your warriors," he declared loudly. "Your judgment has been compromised by sentiment, your strength sapped by misplaced kindness. Stand aside and let me protect our people." But before Ulfar could respond, an unexpected voice cut through the morning air. Ragna had stepped forward from the crowd, moving with quiet dignity toward the two men who would decide the fate of so many. In her weathered hands, she carried a simple wooden bowl, one of the traditional vessels used for offering hospitality to guests, carved with the symbols of welcome and sanctuary. "Before anyone sounds that horn," she said, her voice carrying clearly across the beach, "perhaps we should remember what it truly means to be strong." The crowd stirred with surprise at her intervention. For a woman to speak in such a moment was unprecedented, yet something in her bearing commanded attention. She had found her voice in the crucible of crisis, and with it came an authority born not of position but of moral clarity. "Bjorn speaks of protecting our people," Ragna continued, her eyes moving across the assembled faces. "But what are we protecting them from? Families seeking shelter, children who have lost their homes, elders who carry nothing more dangerous than the wisdom of their years." Bjorn's face flushed with anger. "You dare interfere in matters of war and peace. Your place is not my place," Ragna interrupted with quiet steel, "is wherever truth needs to be spoken. And the truth is in that burned letter you carry, the one you've twisted to serve your ambition." She gestured toward the parchment still clutched in Bjorn's free hand. "That message speaks of refugees, not raiders. Of families torn apart by violence, seeking nothing more than the chance to rebuild their lives in peace. I've read enough of it to know the truth, even if you choose to ignore it." A murmur ran through the crowd as people turned to look at the burned letter with new understanding. Bjorn had been so focused on using it as evidence of threat that he had never allowed anyone else to examine it closely. Now, with Ragna's words casting doubt on his interpretation, cracks began to appear in his carefully constructed narrative. "She lies," Bjorn snarled, but his voice carried less certainty than before. "This woman has clouded the chieftain's judgment, and now she seeks to cloud yours as well." Ulfar watched the exchange with growing admiration for Ragna's courage. She had risked everything to speak the truth, knowing that her intervention would make her a target for those who opposed her. Yet she stood firm, the hospitality bowl in her hands, a symbol of the values she was fighting to preserve. "Let me see the letter," called out old Magnus Thorson, the respected craftsman who had apologized to Ragnar at the feast. "If it truly speaks of threat, then we should all know its contents." Others began to voice similar demands, their confidence in Bjorn's interpretation shaken by Ragnar's accusations. The young warrior found himself facing a crowd that was no longer willing to take his word without proof. Their trust eroded by the possibility that he had deceived them. "There's no time for debate," Bjorn insisted, raising the horn toward his lips. "The ships are almost at the shore. I will sound the call to arms," and his words were cut short as Ulfar moved with the swift precision of a trained warrior. In one fluid motion, he reached out and grasped the horn, his strong fingers closing over Bjorn's grip. The two men struggled briefly for control of the ancient instrument, but Ulfar's experience and determination proved superior. "The horn belongs to the chieftain," Ulfar said firmly, pulling the carved tusk from Bjorn's grasp. "And I am still chieftain of this clan." With the horn secure in his hands, Ulfar stepped toward the water's edge. The lead refugee ship was close enough now that he could see the faces of those aboard. Tired, hopeful, desperate people who had entrusted their lives to the mercy of strangers. A man stood at the bow, his weathered hands cupped around his mouth as he prepared to call out across the narrowing gap of water. Ulfar raised the horn to his lips, feeling the weight of tradition and responsibility flow through him. The choice was his to make, and he had decided to trust in wisdom rather than fear, in compassion rather than suspicion. The sound that emerged from the ancient instrument was clear and pure, carrying across the water with unmistakable meaning. 3 long blasts echoed across the fjord, the traditional call of welcome, the signal that strangers would find sanctuary rather than sword point on these shores. As the sound faded into the morning air, a profound silence fell over the assembled crowd, broken only by the gentle lapping of waves against the beach. The refugees had received their answer, and the clan had witnessed their chieftain's choice. Now all that remained was to see whether Ulfar's trust would be vindicated, or whether his compassion would prove to be the deadly mistake that Bjorn had predicted. The refugees had received their answer, and the clan had witnessed their chieftain's choice. Now all that remained was to see whether Ulfar's trust would be vindicated, or whether his compassion would prove to be the deadly mistake that Bjorn had predicted. 6 weeks had passed since the morning that changed everything, and the settlement of Hrafnbjorn had settled into a new rhythm that embraced both its traditions and its growth. The autumn air carried the scent of fresh bread and wood smoke, but now it also held the voices of children, speaking in accents from distant shores, adding new melodies to the familiar symphony of daily life. In the great hall, the most significant change was not in its structure, but in its spirit. The long tables remained the same, but they had been supplemented with additional seating, wider benches crafted by the settlement's carpenters, working alongside refugee craftsmen who brought skills from their lost homes. The hall that had once echoed with the exclusive laughter of clan members now rang with the broader joy of an expanded community. At the head of the hall, Ulfar's carved throne remained in its place of honor, but now it bore a new addition. Carved into the armrest, where all could see, it was a simple image, 2 hands reaching out to help each other, intertwined in a gesture of mutual support. The carving was fresh, its edges still sharp and clean, marking the moment when leadership had evolved, beyond mere strength, to embrace wisdom and compassion. Ulfar himself sat easily in the great chair, his bearing confident and relaxed in a way that spoke of trials survived and lessons learned. The scar on his face seemed less prominent now, softened perhaps by the satisfaction of choices well made. Around him, the mixed community that had emerged from that crisis morning went about the business of preparing for the evening's meal. Not a formal feast this time, but the daily gathering that had become their new tradition. Among those working to prepare the meal was Ragna, her movements sure and purposeful as she directed the arrangement of tables and the placement of benches. The months since that transformative morning had brought changes to her as well, not in her appearance, which remained much as it had been, but in her bearing and confidence. She moved through the hall with the authority of someone who knew her worth and had seen it recognized by others. The silver bracelet still circled her wrist, Magnus's gift that connected her to her past, while no longer binding her to old sorrows. She wore it now as a reminder of love given and received, rather than as a weight of loss. The grief remained, but it had been transformed from isolation into empathy, allowing her to reach out to others who carried their own burdens. "The tables look welcoming," Astrid observed, approaching with an armload of wooden cups and bowls. Her sharp tongue had found new targets in the weeks since the crisis, mainly in defending the integration efforts against the occasional grumbling of those who still viewed change with suspicion. "They should," Ragna replied with satisfaction. "Everyone deserves a place where they can sit comfortably and feel truly welcome." The refugee families had proven to be exactly what their burned letter had described, people seeking nothing more than the chance to rebuild their lives in safety. Among them were skilled craftsmen, experienced fishermen, wise elders, and children who had brought new energy to the settlement's daily life. Their integration had not been without challenges, but it had proceeded with remarkable smoothness thanks to Ulfar's steady leadership. And the example set by those willing to embrace change. Bjorn Ironson entered the hall carrying firewood for the evening's warmth. His demeanor notably different from the aggressive confidence he had displayed during the crisis. The weeks following Ulfar's vindication had been difficult for the young warrior, as the clan had witnessed the contrast between his fearful assumptions and the peaceful reality of the refugees' arrival. His support had melted away like snow in spring sun, leaving him isolated and humbled. To his credit, Bjorn had eventually come forward to acknowledge his errors and ask forgiveness from both Ulfar and the refugee families he had sought to turn away. The process had been painful but necessary, teaching him lessons about leadership that no amount of sword training could provide. Now he worked quietly to rebuild trust and demonstrate the wisdom he had gained from his mistakes. "The evening looks to be pleasant," he said to Ragna as he stacked wood by the great hearth, his tone respectful and genuinely contrite. "Is there anything else that needs to be done?" "Just the final preparations," Ragna replied kindly. "Thank you for asking." The exchange was brief but significant, representing the healing that had taken place within their community. Forgiveness had proven to be another form of strength, one that built bridges rather than walls and created opportunities for growth rather than cycles of resentment. As the sun began its descent toward the western hills, the hall filled with the voices of the expanded community gathering for their evening meal. Families from the original settlement mingled easily with those who had arrived on the refugee ships, their children playing together while their parents shared stories and advice. The barriers that had once seemed so important had dissolved in the face of shared humanity and common purpose. Ulfar rose from his throne, not to make a formal speech, but simply to welcome everyone to another day's end in their growing community. The carved hands on his chair's armrest caught the firelight, serving as a permanent reminder of the choice that had shaped their new reality. "We gather tonight as we do each evening," he said, his voice carrying easily through the hall, "not as strangers bound together by circumstance, but as neighbors choosing to build something better than what we inherited." The words were simple, but they carried the weight of transformation earned through trial and commitment. The settlement that had once defined itself by exclusion now thrived through inclusion, stronger not in spite of its diversity but because of it. As conversations resumed and the evening meal began, Ragna looked around the hall with deep satisfaction. The narrow benches that had once seemed designed to exclude her had been replaced with seating that welcomed all. The whispers that had once cut like blades had been replaced with laughter that warmed like fire. Most importantly, the community that had once measured worth by appearance now valued contribution and character above all else. The carved ravens above the hall's entrance continued their eternal watch. But now they looked down upon a people who had learned that true strength came not from the ability to defeat others, but from the wisdom to lift them up. The Feast of Harvest had become a daily celebration of growth, and the settlement of Bjorn had discovered that the greatest victories were those won not through conquest, but through the simple, revolutionary act of choosing kindness when the world expected cruelty.